Hello, welcome to the Art Channel. Today Joshua and myself are at Serpentine Galleries looking at Suspended States by Yinka Shonibare. So Josh, why are we here? Why are we looking at Shonibare?
Well, Yinka Shonibare has been enormously successful and again influential, thinking about post-colonial hybridity, and that's how he sort of describes himself, as a post-colonial hybrid. He grew up between this country and Nigeria, and what interests him really is the cultural flow and exchange of ideas through trade, through colonisation, into contemporary life. But basically he's saying we are all composed of lots of different ideas and influences that are global, really, in reach.
And I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that he's for 3 decades been looking at Europe's relationship to Africa, mostly through those colonial relationships. And he is also interested in our relationship to ecology, to the planet.
Yeah, and in this exhibition, what he's done is he has painted these replicas of famous sculptures. We can recognize Churchill and Queen Victoria over there, but these other men, which sit in central London, they are colonial administrators and soldiers. So they would have been very famous in their time, but they're largely forgotten now. So he's reminding us of these histories. But of course, what has he done? He's taken that rather stiff, formal idea of a bronze sculpture and applied this design to the surface.
And they are, what, 2/3 normal size maybe? And they are down at our eye level. So we're meeting them almost as equal. So their power is taken away through that action.
And the critical idea for Shonibare, this kind of motif that he uses, is this Dutch wax resist cloth. So he's using the motif of a cloth that originated in Indonesia through a batik process. And it's now more commonly known as resist. So it's a form of printing through blocking out areas of the cloth. But what interests Shonibare is the way in which, of course, it's been translated from Indonesia through the Netherlands, the Dutch colonizing power, and then subsequently its export to West Africa. And now, ironically, much of this cloth is produced in China.
It's a weird journey, and it's an amazing idea to carry through the sculptures, isn't it? To make us look at, I mean, as he says, he found it, I think, initially in Brixton Market, a market in South London, and he assumed it was African produced. And then you get into the history of something, and it's part of that horrible trade in enslaved people. And as you say, it's a complex history. Nothing is as it seems.
It's a metaphor for him of the way in which culture is really fluid and pliable, and there is no true notion of cultural or national purity. And it's a very honest and important idea.
He's interested, isn't he, particularly, I mean, there's been a lot of debate recently about the place of statues in our society. Statues have been taken down, they've been destroyed, they've been vandalised, removed. People have felt very strongly about those people who represent a colonial way of life, and they've taken them away. But he, as you say, thinks that we should recontextualize them, put them into museums, talk about them, think about them, and crucially, notice them again.
Just add that debate. Let's be frank about our history. And I think fundamentally, for Shonibare, he's reminding us that our history is nuanced, it's complex, it's subtle. There are so many different ideas that flow into making up contemporary societies.
But he does, nevertheless, challenge that dominant societal model. I mean, Churchill,
yeah.
Victoria, representing colonial Britain and all those terrible things that happened. So he is, as you say, looking at it from kind of 360. He's looking at it all round, but igniting that conversation again. sanctuary city is a collection of buildings that ostensibly are meant to offer sanctuary. There are women's refuges, there is Notre Dame, there is the UN building. All of these safe places have been attacked and been under attack. And Shonibare is adding to this city of buildings as he goes. And it's very dramatic, it's very beautiful, and it's tiny, which is quite unusual for him.
And on the insides of the building, you'll see how he's applied this Dutch cloth again, Dutch wax resist cloth. So it reminds us, reinforces that point of this rich cultural history we've been discussing. And furthermore, of course, he's making a plea for the principle of sanctuary for people who are fleeing persecution and oppression, that there are safe places for them to go.
The War Library is a library full of tomes covered in this Dutch wax cloth, and each title refers to a peace treaty or a conflict. So you have Iran crisis of 1946. Each title reminds us that we are still fighting and trying to make amends, and I believe this is an ongoing project.
There's a tension because it's so decorative, it's so appealing. And look at the variety of the cloth, all these thousands of different designs. And yet they describe on the spines this long, long history of human conflict that just doesn't seem to end. And he's asking us, at what point are we going to learn that war just creates chaos, havoc, pain and suffering?
I think there's also something about books and libraries. There's something about a community or a society's culture, its literature, its belief system. So books are always very evocative. You know, we think of burning people's books, that never leaves your mind.
There's also, I think, this notion that wars can be studied by historians and analysed. And in fact, it is really just the sort of total collapse of human civilization. War is failure. In the terminals here on the desk, he has used a team of 10 researchers to actually describe each of these conflicts and treaties. So it's backed by this information, which is kind of digitally stored, but represented by these titles here.
It's an old and new library. And I think he says, as you said, this is a history of failure. Shonibare is interested in exploring boundaries, identity, nationalism, colonialism. Does this exhibition help us understand that?
Yeah, absolutely, because he has a really elegant way of expressing quite complex ideas. He has this consistent interest in asking all of us about our own sense of identity and reminding us that actually where we come from, how we shape ourselves, who influences us in terms of identity, are all sort of quite problematic and unresolved. They're not easily sort of pigeonholed.
I think it's truly postmodern, isn't it? In that our identities, even the idea of a national identity, is incredibly complex and nuanced, and maybe doesn't exist anymore. And he is asking us those questions. They're really decorative, which you could say demeans them. Actually, I think it makes them accessible and opens them up to a huge audience. And that Dutch waxcloth, although decorative, has that really complex history, and it's a great way into the work.
I think he's very optimistic and generous as an artist. He supported lots of young and emerging artists through his foundation and shared his success. And he really embraces that notion of multiculturalism, really, and of sharing ideas, of sharing experience. And in that way, I think this show is very relatable.
It's a clever thing to do, to communicate complex, nuanced ideas through accessible, in some ways joyful work.